Thank you very much for coming so late on such a balmy evening. And I know you've all been running across COP to the left, COP to the right, trying to catch a taxi, probably totally exhausted. But we just need one last push from you now to talk about carbon markets and how they can be really supportive of decarbonization in the industrial sectors. So welcome. My name is Matthew Harwood. I'm the Chief Strategy Officer at Climate Investment. It's our little logo at the top of the slide there on the screen. Climate Investment is a fund manager, and we invest in companies both at the venture stage and the growth equity stage that can support decarbonization in some difficult sectors, so in energy, in industry, in the built environment, and in transport. And we've seen through our portfolio of now nearly 40 companies who are really doing this in the real world, the tremendous potential opportunity that carbon markets can bring to support the adoption of these technologies in the developing world. But when we look at carbon markets, they're not really doing very much in these space. You guys know they're doing stuff in nature-based, which is great, and looking at removals, which is also great, although faces technical challenges. And we just started asking ourselves the question, why not more in these big, polluting, growing sectors where we really need to take action and take action fast? And so we started getting together a group of experts to help us think this through, many of whom are in the audience and maybe online as well. Are we broadcasting online too? Great. And we'd like to share some of their thinking and expertise with you in this event and encourage questions around it. But just to talk about the agenda we wanted to take you through is we wanted to root this conversation in our experiences through actually working at the coalface. And we're going to have invited two of our portfolio companies to present some little case studies to explain what they're seeing at the coalface both in energy but also in the built environment. Our second speaker, Gaurav, was going to be joining online, sadly, because he couldn't get a ticket to get into the Blue Zone. And then we're going to transition to get the panel up and do some Q&A around that. So that's how the session's going to run. But before we do that, and before we invite our first portfolio company up to talk to you, Liz is just going to set the scene a little bit and say a few words. Thanks, Liz.
%60 of the technologies that we need to reach net zero are already commercially viable and available today. This statistic from the IEA really encourages me and makes me think that we've really got a chance at reaching net zero and limiting the impacts of climate change. But we know that there are significant barriers to deploying this technology in the regions that need it and in the hard-to-abate sectors, so-called hard-to-abate sectors, particularly in the developing world. We want to use today's session to highlight how we think that carbon markets can play a role to really catalyze the deployment of these technologies in the developing world. Great. As you'll all be well aware, global greenhouse gas emissions are continuing to rise, and 2022 was the all-time high of greenhouse gas emissions. Emissions from fossil fuel combustion and industrial processes continue to be the drivers of growth and are continuing to grow. For us to reach 1.5 degrees, we require a drastic cut in emissions of over 40% by 2030, which is just around the corner. We know that we have the technologies to address much of this, but there are significant barriers to getting these technologies to the areas that need them. Many of the low and middle income countries do not have the policy and regulatory incentives that the EU and the US may have, and therefore do not have what is necessary to spur uptake and do not have that incentive to cover that upfront cost of that technology. As a result, these technologies have received less than a quarter of global climate finance flows. Carbon credits can act as a mechanism to get finance to projects that would otherwise not have taken place. We believe that this can be particularly impactful in industrial use cases, for example, in fugitive emission reduction, energy efficiency improvement, industrial CCUS, and amongst other types of projects. Historically, less than 25% of retired carbon credits have gone to industrial projects. This is despite over 60% of emissions coming from energy, industry, and the built environment, and the emissions from these sectors continuing to grow. Industrial carbon credits typically face lower demand relative to other project types, and this may be because of the market perception of emissions reductions projects, but also because of the lower apparent marketing value that these projects may have. However, we believe that these projects really have the potential to be high impact and are well suited to the carbon market. First, we believe that these projects can be high integrity. While we know that the different project types within the industrial category will differ and have different characteristics, we believe that many of them are highly measurable. For example, we have recently seen, over the past few years, we've seen significant improvement in remote sensing, and this can be a mechanism to measure the impact that these projects are having. Second, these projects can have immediate impact now by stopping emissions reduction. This can be even higher in the short term in methane-focused projects, given the higher global warming potential of methane. Third, these projects have the potential to have additional co-benefits, such as improving air quality, providing employment, and improving working conditions. Our ambition at Climate Investment is to see increased demand for these types of projects. Over the past few weeks, we've been engaging a variety of stakeholders, and many of you are here in the room today, to further this ambition, but also challenge it. Together, we have crafted a set of principles, which are shown on the screen, to ensure that we develop this initiative and further this initiative, considering all of the dynamics of the carbon credit market, and ensure that we're doing this in a credible way. You will now hear about two project types in this category, ICA Finance and 75F. We'll then move into a discussion around how we can ensure buyer confidence in purchasing these types of credits. Thank you. Torleif, over to you.
Yeah? This? There we are, yeah. Good evening, everyone. So my name is Torleif Haugland. I'm from ICA Finance. ICA Finance is a company that has been in the space of developing carbon credit projects in 2005, specializing really on flare reduction and methane emission reductions. And we've been part of the sort of ups and downs of the carbon market. We've generated some 10 million tons of emission reductions over a 10-year period now, raising about 72 million euros in carbon credit revenues for development of the projects. Right now, we're entering a new phase now. You know, we've been through the CDM. We're entering a new phase where there obviously will be growth in this market. And we are on the ground. So we're on the ground really in 3-4 regions, in Central Asia, in the Middle East and North Africa, in Nigeria, and hopefully also soon in Latin America. Our focus now is really on 3 project categories. It will expand over time, I think, but this is what we're focusing on now. So that is flare gas recovery. It's leak detection and repair to avoid methane emissions. And it's installation of vapor recovery units for the same, to eliminate methane emission reductions. And we try to focus on projects that has a short lead time. I mean, projects that can be implemented and starting to generate projects early. Also for flare projects, so it's not the largest flares, but it's flares that obviously will, or that should qualify under our carbon credit program. And it is methane projects that can deliver results quickly. And, you know, as we've seen very much from the discussions and what has happened over the last few days, this is really what is in demand. It is to act quickly and get results quickly in methane emission reductions. So it's for that reason that is our focus. And let me also say that we are working both on methane and flaring, but methane, there's good reasons to really focus on methane, because that is the low-hanging fruit here. And it's significant in amount. It's 5 times as much in sort of even a conservative estimation of greenhouse gas equivalents. It's 5 times as much as flaring, although flaring is a larger waste. So this is why we focus on that. The other reason why this is important is that it is low-hanging fruit. And as you see here, this is, many of you would know the IEA's work on really assessing the abatement cost, I mean the net cost of doing methane emission reductions, and that there are a lot of projects that have negative costs. I think they exaggerate. I think they exaggerate the revenue, so I would dispute some of the numbers, but it's clear it is low-hanging fruit. So it should be taken. And as you see, I pointed here of this curve as different type of measures. And you see here, I mean, those that really are below the x-axis here are projects that we focus on. Now, we also know there's a lot of momentum now. There's a lot of regulation in the North America, in the EU, will have regulation, which is going to be effective. There's a lot of action with IOCs and with other oil companies as well. So they will pick up a large part of the, or not a large part, but they will pick up part of that. Also, the other 50 companies now who pledge, you know, that they will do something, some of them will pick it up. But it's very clear that in many jurisdictions and with many companies, little will happen. Little has happened to now, and not enough will happen. So that needs to be addressed. And it can be addressed really in several ways. I mean, it's natural to think that it should be addressed through new regulations. But again, it's very important to be aware of what jurisdiction we're talking about here. We are talking about jurisdictions for a large part, at least in the part that where we are, where there's no framework conditions for having regulations. There's not capacity within the institutions to do it properly, and there's not enforcement of regulation in cases where they actually implement regulations. And we've seen this over again. So it's important to focus on regulation and get companies or countries actually to establish regulation, but we can't wait for that. So what is the best we can hope for? Well, the best we can hope for is that the industry itself actually act. Some of them will, and some of them are doing it. It's good news what's happening now, but quite a few will not, unless there are economic incentives to do so. I mean, other type of incentives. So if you see at the right part of my slide here, what are the incentives? I mean, one obvious incentive is that the market would penalize those who have high emissions in the value chain. That could be, I mean, border taxes, as they're talking about the EU. It could be other ways, right? So that might happen, but neither will that necessarily happen quickly. So then we have, I mean, climate finance, grants and soft loans being discussed also extensively this week, but there also needs to be sort of really a stepping up of the role of carbon finance and the carbon market for these type of projects. So this is sort of our point, right? And you know, I listed some carbon credit programs here, right? We have Article 6.4, which is not operational yet. We have 6.2, which operates, but where there's no projects of these categories. It's the voluntary market carbon programs, which actually don't pay. I mean, there are projects that are being, or transactions that are being made, but they're traded at about, let's say, $3 to $5, maybe less, and it's not enough. It really is, it covers transaction costs, and perhaps a bit more, but not enough. So it's only this, I mean, we are in one very specialized compliance-based market, which is called the EU Fuel Quality Directive market, which is an offset market, which pays properly, but it's a small market. It's not more than 2.5 million tons per annum, and you need to step up from that. But that's not going to happen unless, I mean, two things are needed. The prices, the willingness to pay for these type of credits need to be higher, or I would say, and you need to bundle projects so you get the transaction cost down. And also to increase the scope, actually, of doing these type of projects. So you need to bundle projects into programs. And this is really what should be done. It really is also the means to get private capital into methane mitigation. Because what we're talking about to a large extent now is public funds to finance projects. It's not going to be enough. You need to get private finance for this. So that is another reason, actually, both for the private sector to pay for the voluntary markets, but also to actually extend it by making programs. So let me just finish by, I say that the prices or the willingness to pay should be higher. And then people would ask, well, why? I mean, the willingness to pay is low. It's, let's say, 1/10 of what one is willing to pay for a unit of mangrove project, for example, of emission reductions from mangrove. So let me try to say something about the quality of what we're doing in the context of the core carbon principles. Well, additionality is the first thing we're thinking about. I think it's easy to make the arguments for many projects, not all projects, of course. Some of them are are economic, so it needs to be tested whether the barriers are such that it should, really pass the additionality test. But there are barriers, but the barriers will just last for a limited point of time. Robust methods for monitoring, reporting, and verification. Projects score high and higher because the technology for actually doing measurement of what is the baseline emissions are improving, and the methods for actually calculating the emission reductions are also improving. So and the other thing, of course, is that these methods that are being used are very conservative in terms of calculating emission reductions. We use the global warming potential of 25 in the methodology which is being used now, and that is, less than one third of what it is if you count on the global warming potential of methane in 20 years potential. So there's the other thing which is interesting and which is important, we've experienced, and that is that the methods actually is very conservative in the emission reductions. We've done some measurement surveys in Central Asia that really shows that the actual emissions are maybe 8 to 10 times as much as the emissions that are allowed under the current methodology which is being used. So the actual impacts as compared to what is being monetized as impacts are many times larger. So last thing on core carbon principles is, of course, the whole issue of permanence, and of course methane doesn't have the permanence problems as nature-based credits have. The last thing I would mention here, which is typical for the project we're doing, but also I think typical for many of the projects that will be done in this sector, is that what we are doing, we're doing really learning by doing. We're working with national oil companies and other companies that don't have the practice of needing to deal with methane emission reductions, right? So our objective is really through the projects, I mean, the projects that have low capex, the LDARs, the VRUs, doing efficient flares. We start with doing carbon credit projects. We bundle projects into programs, and the ultimate objective is to get the companies actually to internalize these practices in their own organizations. And I basically think that this is the way also the carbon credit programs should view this, that many of these things are not necessarily, or many of the projects are not additional or wouldn't pass in the long term, because you're building capacity, you're building common practice in these countries and with the companies. That was it. Thank you.
Great. Torleif, thank you so much. I think we're now going to try and go into the virtual world, and I think the IETA team are going to help us do that. We're so sorry we couldn't bring Gaurav along because he's very, very compelling live, but I'm hoping he will be pretty compelling virtually. There he is. He's also very handsome as well, as you can tell. So, Gaurav, can you hear us okay in here?
Yes, Matt, I can hear you loud and clear.
Great. Hand over to you then.
Just show the screen. Trust my screen is visible. Thank you, Matt. Thank you, Climate Investments. I will be presenting a small case study that we have carried out over the last year or so. But before that, just to lay the context a little bit about 75F and what exactly we do. We're an IoT, cloud, ML, and AI-based BMS company, and Climate Investments were good enough to invest in us about 4 years ago. Till date, we have commissioned approximately 827 buildings across the US, India, Southeast Asia, and we're now present in the Middle East. We've covered a total square footage of approximately 31.4 million square feet. We have saved approximately 91.2 million kilowatt hours till date, and we've reduced an equivalent of about 72,000 tons of carbon dioxide. That's roughly the equivalent of planting a shade over 1 million trees. These are a few of the folks behind 75F, one of whom was good enough to be here a few days ago. Basically what we are is we're a system of sensors, zone controllers, master controllers with the software, and then the analytics using the cloud and getting it installed within the built environment, that is commercial buildings. And within the commercial buildings, we particularly focus on the HVAC systems, chillers and air handler units and DX units and rooftop units and what have you. And our USP is really the greater quantum of energy savings that we're able to deliver, as well as the analytics and the automation that comes as part and parcel of the platform. So now the case study that I'm going to tell you a little bit about is at one of the largest omni-channel retailers in the region, with a presence in the Middle East as well as in India and Southeast Asia. They have about 2,300 stores, total space of about 30 million square feet, and they're present all across the region. So their problem was a simple one. They said that we have stores in malls, we have standalone stores, and most of them have equipments which are 15, 20, 25 years old. We feel we're paying too much for our energy bills, and can you help us? So we went in there, we studied some of the stores, and this was just in India that we studied the setup. We did some pilots. We actually had to do several pilots for them. And to cut a long story short, they have deployed the 75 ref solutions of sensors, controllers, software in approximately 76 stores as we speak. And these are across 40 cities of India, a total of about 1.2 million square feet. Took us about 3 days to complete the smaller stores and about 5 to 7 days for the larger stores. And show you a little bit about the good stuff, which is really the dashboards that talk about the energy that we've been able to save for them across these stores. So we were committed to save approximately 30%. I'm happy to report that we're currently saving about 41 to 42% of the HVAC energy at these outlets. And the dashboards, this is a screen grab taken from the live dashboards of the client in terms of how much electricity, how much cost savings, how much equivalent carbon reduction they were able to drive, and then they can drill down into all kinds of regional views, city views, store views, comparison year on year, and what have you. So if you take a look at the graphs over onto the right, it represents the breakup and by month and by store and all kinds of things. But the important one is the graph on the bottom right-hand side with a bunch of lines. So there's the orange line, which is the baseline. There's the blue line, which is the guaranteed or the committed energy savings. And there's the wavy green line, which is the, I beg your pardon, not the savings, these are the consumption. And there's the wavy green line, which is the actual consumption in real time, as evidenced by the energy meters, which are connected at all the stores and which are reporting into the platform in real time. So as you can see, we mostly come in a little bit lower than the committed or the guaranteed energy savings. The impact in terms of the kilowatt hours or megawatt hours saved is over on the right-hand side, and this is the client was looking at cost savings, and they were looking at being a responsible corporate citizen, so they wanted the megawatt hours saved and they wanted the tons of carbon dioxide saved. So this was phase one that we have deployed. So this is all the good stuff. Now, this project took us almost 3 years in the making to convince the customer, and this involved pilots, this involved deployments, this involved a lot of financial negotiations with the customer. And the actual implementation was literally 2 weeks, 3 weeks or whatever, which stretched out to about 3 or 4 months, given festival seasons and other things that were happening. But the time that was spent prior to making up their minds by the client was something like 3 years, and sure, COVID had a little bit to do with it, but mainly it was a financial decision that was being taken, and multiple levels of approval, multiple levels of decision making. So what actually took all that time? And if you can cast an eye over the 2 tables that I have, and this is actually taken from the client now that we're in there and we've completed phase 1, they're now talking to us for a deployment of 600 stores in the Middle East, and hopefully we can leverage that and save a lot more. But this is something that the client shared, and we took the liberty of reproducing it here. So an IRR of approximately 15.42% is what the project is currently delivering. And believe me, it was about 11 or 12% at the beginning at the time of negotiation. And we were put under the pump in terms of improving this and lowering the costs and increasing the energy savings, which we did. We had to do multiple rounds of piloting and all. We had to give guarantees in the form of financial commitments that were actually put in escrow accounts to ensure that we stayed honest in terms of the commitments. Now, if there's a line item in there that adds for one sample store, which is in Commercial Street in Bangalore, and if the carbon credits were to be, the customer is not able to today claim the carbon credits because no such scheme exists in India today. there is some work going on, and I'll talk a little bit about that in the subsequent slide. But if the client were to actually avail of these carbon credits, the IRR for the project would actually be touching about 20%. And I have it from the CFO of the company that had we been able to show them a 20% business case, they would have probably decided 2 years ago to go ahead with it and would have probably implemented 1,000 stores by now. Instead, we're sitting at 700 stores 3 years later, and a lot of, iterations of the project that we've had to go through to get it up to this point. So this is really my last slide that talks about the clean development mechanism, and there's a certain protocol which is being worked out by the Indian government, and I believe possibly in March of next year is when it's slated to be released, and then we will see how it takes off. The numbers that I've used to indicate the improvement in the IRR are taken at today's rates, which are fairly low. So, if the rates, as many other esteemed speakers have spoken, do increase, then you could possibly talk of an IRR moving from 15% to 30%, in which case it becomes a no-brainer for most CFOs. So just leave you with that thought that if such schemes were available, then leave it to your imagination as to how many more million kilowatt hours a small company like us could have saved in the time thus far. Thank you.
Thank you, Gareth. Thank you very much. That was really, really interesting. It's great to ground us all in a couple of real examples. Right now, I'd like to invite my panel of experts to come and join me. So could I ask Maurizio, Mark, Pedro, and Sarah to come and join me on the stage? We're going to get into a little bit of Q&A. Ayeta team, do I have a mic or do I need to stand? Yeah, could you, so I can sit down with them. Is that okay? Great. So thanks, guys, for joining us here. I think just for efficiency, what I'll do is when I bring each of you in, maybe I can ask you just to say a few words about yourself and your institution, so we can make it kind of simple. And I would like to start with you, Sarah, the buy side of this equation. So you're from Occidental. I'd like to congratulate you on all of the work you've put in with your team this week. Some fantastic announcements. I saw your CEO on the stage this morning talking about this big oil and gas initiative. And you're doing a lot in the energy transition. But now I really want you to put on your sort of sustainability officer hat and talk about how you think about the potential to use carbon credits as part of your net zero plan, and what are some of the kind of the challenges that you face in thinking about that and putting that plan together.
Thanks, Matt. So as Matt mentioned, I'm Sarah Izzat. I'm Manager of Global Sustainable Solutions at Oxy. So Oxy is an oil and gas company transitioning to carbon management. So in addition to having our oil and gas business, we also are commercializing direct air capture technology through our 1.5 subsidiary. And so it is a very interesting interplay, and that does do a lot for our trajectories towards net zero. So I'll talk a bit about that. As an oil and gas company, Oxy was the first U.S. company to align with the Paris agreements and set a commitment to net zero by 2050 for scopes 1, 2, and 3 emissions. So we're very committed to meeting that, and we've been making strides and doing our best to show progress very quickly. So we consider several core tenets within our trajectories towards net zero and actions that we can take in the short, mid, and long term, because those solutions do tend to look very different. And it's something that I agree with Torley found, he touched on a little bit, that credits may help, especially in the near term. It's a good place to start, as you mentioned. So I'll talk a little bit about our overall net zero strategy and implementation plan as it sits today. So those short, mid, and long-term options, they include for us lower carbon operations, lower carbon facilities designs, the use of lower carbon electricity, and this may be through, at first, greening of the grid, so in the short term. In the medium to long term, it also includes utilization of renewables, but also net power. So it's another climate technology that we're actually actively working to commercialize, and that's a zero carbon electricity generation technology. And then also sourcing of anthropogenic carbon dioxide dioxide via direct air capture, as well as industrial point sources. And that's for use for enhanced oil recovery in our business, as well as sequestration in some cases. And so, we believe that it is very important to be contributing to commercializing these climate technologies, and that is because as an oil and gas company with a chemicals arm, et cetera, we are very well positioned and perhaps one of the only companies that can actually pull this off with direct air capture. I mean, we've got, countless synergies. It's something that we just believe, we need to be doing. Not to say that we can't do well while doing good, which is, what Vicky always cites. So we do see that there's a business case around that. These things are very important. However, we also understand the critical importance of doing our best to move as quickly as possible in our own operation. So we have to decarbonize. We have to be addressing the methane. And that's something that we've proven that, we're very committed to doing. So we are committed to the World Bank's Zero Routine Flaring by 2030 initiative, something we take very seriously. And in fact, we've already met zero routine flaring in our U.S. onshore resources and assets 8 years ahead of schedule. We're continuing to make progress in the rest of our assets, not just for routine flaring, but we're also addressing non-routine flaring, so going above and beyond there. We also are committed to the environmental program, the Oil and Gas Methane Partnership 2.0. So that's, obviously working toward getting our methane intensity down to 0.25% of our marketed gas by 2025. So as of this morning, as you mentioned, we did announce that we have committed to the Oil and Gas Decarbonization Charter. So that's yet another kind of milestone for us to align to near zero methane by 2035, as well as zero routine flaring by 2030 and net zero scope 1 and 2, which is in alignment with the rest of our targets. So yeah, we've had a lot of success. We've actually reduced our methane intensity, our overall methane emissions by 58% since 2019. So that is mostly in our operations and doing a lot of the things that Torleif was talking about. So we have to just really scrutinize what we've got. And so it's very interesting to see, because sometimes given these constraints, we do innovate and we actually find ways to make our own business more efficient, which could actually improve our economics. I think a certain percentage of the projects will fall into that camp, and the teams are challenging themselves to find those solutions. So that's been really gratifying and really excellent. But that's under a regime where we do have incentives within the United States, et cetera, to start making that progress. We do see in other places it's going to be a little bit more difficult, more expensive, harder to incentivize. The last thing I'll say is within our DAC business, we understand the challenges there around removal credits. So understanding that removal credits are more well accepted even than reductions, but even getting a high integrity, high quality credit that is verifiable, is very transparent. That's been something that we are really working towards. And I will also mention that we've, been able to work to get our Sensor Up platform deployed. So that's going to be, methane measurement and detection. That's something that's going to be, really helpful. And it's existing technology that we need to scale up as quickly as possible to help towards that end.
Thank you very much, Sarah. A very, very comprehensive story there. I want to jump to Pedro next, if you're okay with that, Pedro. It's obviously been a big week this week for voluntary carbon markers, it seems. We've attended a few events, and it looks like you guys have made a lot of progress. I think it was also your birthday this week, right? A little bird told me you might have had a birthday yesterday. So many happy returns. Yeah, he had a song last night apparently. But we'd love to maybe share a little bit of the progress that you've made within the ICVCM around that, just that ensuring the kind of quality of projects and transparency. To tell us a little bit about that, the progress you've made this week, but also how does that reflect on the kind of projects we talked about in this industrial domain, and how does that, your frameworks potentially help those kind of projects, and how do they fit with what you're saying as well as a regulating body?
So thank you for the kind words, and please no singing. So first, just a very quick recap of where we are with the ICVCM. We've basically, throughout the last year and year and a half, have been building up the core carbon principles, and most importantly, what we call the assessment framework, which is essentially a checklist for what those carbon principles, how those carbon principles must be translated into the operation of the carbon crediting programs, and what we in our parlance call categories or project types, if you want. One fundamental thing is that with one, let's say, glaring exception, the approach that we've had as a body is being technology neutral. The glaring exception is that obviously those who have read our guidance, you know that we have a criterion called transition to net zero that excludes those project types or those activities, if you want, that would lock in infrastructure that would move us away from a net zero pathway. So essentially to the point of how do we, so first of all, where are we now? We have that framework, and we're starting the process of assessing project types and understanding what methodologies are meeting our carbon principles. That work will go on for the next few months. That will work in separate working groups, looking at especially the most, let's say, difficult project types, and I won't go into which are difficult and which aren't, because again, that is something that we're working on. But the idea is that within 4 or 5 months, hopefully, we'll be getting out our CCPs, meaning a combination of both approving program governance requirements and approving project level or category level criteria such as we've mentioned here, additionality, permanence, etc. So so the starting point is technology neutrality. Then I would just reflect on the history of industrial credits that, because it's been mentioned here, and I have a history in that. For example, the much oft-quoted HFC23 project type, which in a way, for me, and I'll just have this to say, is a bit of a missed opportunity or a timing issue, because we have actually, we as in the market, but in all fairness, the CDM Executive Board have actually addressed the issue that was meant to be critical. They've only done it way too late for it to have any meaningful impact. So if you, on a very personal level, not at all implicating ICVCM, if you look at the methodology that is currently, let's say, applicable to HFC23 projects, it would meet, I would say, very high standards in terms of quantification. Yeah. But that only happened after a very difficult learning process that basically killed off a great part of the market. Yeah. So we need to improve, and that's what I think, with hope, the ICVCM will be able to do, is we will always be improving on the market. Nobody will have a magic wand that corrects everything, but we must do it in a way that preserves certain type of continuity in the frameworks that the market is serving. So I'll leave it at that as just.
We can come back and expand some more. And I want to get you. So you're in a way you're the fairy godmother of the supply side of this equation, and Mark is the concerned uncle of the demand side. So you with VCMI, you've been really looking at the demand side of this equation, and announced some fantastic work just recently about how do you help corporations and entities buy with more security, really. Could you tell us a little bit about that, and also how you, again, the question of how does that apply to the more industrial type of projects that you're.
Of course, thank you. So my name is Mark Kember. I am the Executive Director of the Voluntary Carbon Market Integrity Initiative, and we're sisters or brothers and fairy godmothers in arms on end-to-end, creating an end-to-end integrity framework for the voluntary carbon market. I'm going to assume that anyone who's been here for more than a few days knows that, anyone who's actually been awake over the last year knows there have been a lot of challenges for voluntary carbon markets and carbon markets in general. And yet, I think it would be fair to say we believe they have a huge potential, particularly as a form of development finance, but also a way to raise ambition in the corporate world, if done with integrity and if done well. And that means, whereas ICVCM is looking at the supply side, as Pedro has said, we look at the demand side. And it's one the two questions we seek to answer are: how and under what circumstances can companies credibly make voluntary use of carbon credits, and what can they credibly say about it? And that's, am I a climate superhero? Am I climate neutral, carbon neutral, whatever it may be? And so we published what we call a claims code of practice. First part in June. We've finished the final part. It feels like a year ago, but it was actually last week. Where companies can now make claims about how their use of carbon credits complements their internal decarbonisation. And it's very much a response to, on the one hand, companies for many years buying a bunch of carbon credits that didn't meet any particular standards and saying, hey, we're carbon neutral. And as we've seen, that's come back to bite them, because there have been companies this year who have been called out in public, but also companies that have been sued for misrepresenting. And so as a result of that, we've gone to the other extreme, where many companies who are absolutely doing the right thing are saying, I'm not going to say anything about it. The cost of taking action seems much higher than the cost of doing absolutely nothing at all. So our claims code of practice tries to say, attempts to encourage those who are doing the right thing to go further and shout from the rooftops about it, and those who are thinking about doing the right thing, doing the wrong thing, to think twice and say, okay, we'll back out of here. So what does the claims code look like? It establishes 4 steps, a set of foundational criteria which are designed to embody what represents good corporate practice on climate change in 2023. And so things like, if you want to start buying carbon credits, you need to have a net zero commitment no later than mid-century. You need to have a science-aligned target. And it's a Science-Based Targets Initiative is one way of doing that, but there could be other ways, but they need to be aligned with the science, getting to net zero by 2050. That has to cover all 3 scopes of your emissions. So whereas 20 years ago you could be carbon neutral by offsetting your scope 1 or scope 2, now you've got to go to scope 3. That's good practice. You've got to be lobbying consistent with the Paris Agreement. You can't be buying a bunch of carbon credits and lobbying against policy. So a bunch of basic requirements. And then you demonstrate progress towards your near-term target, which might be 2030, 2025, by demonstrating that your company's senior management is incentivized to meet climate targets as well as make profits, that you're investing CapEx, you're paying OpEx on climate mitigation. And then you use carbon credits to go above and beyond that. And for those who go above their science-based or science-aligned targets, then there are a series of claims you can make: carbon integrity, silver, gold, bronze, and so on and so forth. Silver, gold, and platinum, sorry. And then we introduced last week a beta version of a flexibility claim. We got a lot of feedback from companies, and I'm sure this is experience for you, that scope 3 is proving very challenging, and we need a bit more time to get it right. So we're saying, okay, if you're on track for your scope 1 and 2, then you can use carbon credits to make some of the difference up with guardrails from where you are and where you should be on scope 3. And that's around only for 10 years. The amount of carbon credits should diminish over time. So it's seen as a way to encourage companies to, instead of doing nothing because it's too difficult, or when they're not meeting their targets, to go, to say, okay, I'm going to bridge that gap. This is by buying carbon credits. And so drive investment into the sort of projects that are here. And our final point is the credits you use must meet the ICVCM CCPs, hence the end-to-end high integrity framework.
And we went to your session yesterday where you had GHG protocol, SBTI, ICVCM and VCMI all together, and it was really nice. I thought it was a really good session. I think it gives a lot of confidence now going forward. Maurizio, I could ask you kind of a two-pronged question in a way, because you'll introduce yourself in a second, but you advise a lot of companies about their net carbon strategy as part of your consulting, but also you're a big corporation in your own right. Tell us about both your own challenges, but also what the sort of conversations you're having with your clients around these issues.
Matthew, thank you. So thanks for having me here in the panel and to the fellow panelists. So I'm Mauricio Bermudez. I look after carbon strategy and intelligence at Accenture. Accenture is a $65 billion, 730,000 employee professional services organization providing strategy, consulting, technology, and other outsourcing professional services to most of the Fortune 500 companies in the world. So yeah, one of the big companies no one knows about.
Did you really say 730?
730,000 employees, yeah. I'm in a small part of the business, which is strategy and consulting, and within that, advising clients on their net zero sustainability strategies. I work mostly in the heavy industry side of the spectrum, in oil and gas and chemicals and mining. And first thing I should say as a consultant is thank you to Mark because that framework that VCMI has been developing was the kind of advice we've been providing clients for 10, 15 years, evolving over time, but where clients came to us saying, we want to reduce our emissions, we want to set a target, what do we do? Well, mitigation hierarchy, you begin reducing your own stuff first, then you can compensate, you can make all sorts of claims around it, neutrality, net zero. Now we have a lot more structure around that thanks to SBTI, thanks to many other organizations, but it was about the permanence and the counterparty risk and the environmental integrity of MRV, the co-benefits or unforeseen impacts that the projects could be having, the value chain proximity. So, if you're one type of business and you invest in forestry that has nothing to do with your business, it's a very different story to if you are an agricultural business with a proximity to forestry, for example, in your supply chain. The questions around removals versus avoidance credits. Are you genuinely being additional? These kinds of questions. That transparency, and then even things like advocacy, leadership development. So you guys have beautifully encapsulated and now in a clear guidance what consultants like Accenture and many others have been doing for a while, and we apply that to ourselves. So, for example, if you look at Accenture's own offsetting strategy, it's only residual emissions. Our biggest source of emissions as professional services company is travel. So scope 3, we're flying around all over the place. No line of sight to being able to decarbonize that. And the choices that we've made, trying to keep with these principles, and we need to check, how well we are already aligned with your new guidance. I need to check with my environment team. Hopefully we are already well aligned, but don't want to make that claim. We've gone for funding directly our own removals projects with nature-based solutions. And we are already starting to invest, including with 1.5, around engineered removals, because we want to learn about that too, and we see that as a very promising and necessary part of the carbon compensation equation.
Well, thank you. I guess that tees up my question. Maybe I'll go back to Sarah. Sarah, if you're okay with that, because you just mentioned two types of credits there: the nature-based and the removals. And I guess what we were trying to think about is how could some of these industrial reduction credits play a role in people's strategy. So maybe Sarah, you talked a lot about you could say the really strategic stuff that you're doing on the energy transition, but talk a little bit about your potential use of credits for anything, aligned with what Mark talked about, that you could use potentially as part of your scope 3. How would you think about that in the future with this new guidance that you've heard about here? And would you look at industrial reductions rather than removals or nature-based credits as a buyer?
Yeah. An excellent question, and I think the answer is a little different or unique to Oxy in that we do, put ourselves in a position to where we could potentially provide removals to our own business, depending on the way policy goes, et cetera. So that is something we factor in, though the commercialization of that technology and the scale-up presents sort of what could be viewed as a mid to long-term solution. So we do have, this short-term interim, moment where we're doing everything we can. We're, diverting capital, and we have to be careful with that as well. But I do, think that actually could be very promising if the quality is there. So it is wonderful to hear that various organizations are working on this, and I do think Mark and Pedro and others definitely hit the nail on the head on what would be needed for us to be comfortable to do that. But maybe I'll back up a step first and talk about what I view as a use case for oil and gas operators generally. So just in the work that I've done towards our net zero plans, working diligently with the teams on decarbonizing our operations, it is tough, and there are times when we, even with good faith efforts, we are deploying capital to order equipment to make these plans come to fruition. We are also experiencing things like supply chain delays, and there are increasing demands for things like electrified equipment, and even electrical demand itself is rising because companies are all kind of trying to do the same things and starting to ramp up on their net zero plans as well. And so, if you think about that as a complement within our portfolio of projects, something that and I'll probably challenge you a little bit, on talking about this sequence of when these projects should be deployed. In many cases, we may need some flexibility around that. And it's like, I think it's sort of all hands on deck. It's like, let's get all the projects out there and just deploy as it makes sense as a complement to our business. That allows us the flexibility then to meet the changing business needs and year to year kind of understand, where our challenges lie, and we become more flexible that way. So I do see that it would be very useful to be able to just say, okay, we thought we were going to meet it this year, we didn't because of, an additional 18 months of lead time and a specific, equipment for whatever it may be. Let's go ahead and look into purchasing something this year just to supplement. And I think that is amazing. The other thing I'll say about these credits is, I can see that these industrial credits might feel more comfortable to industry. So an oil and gas company, as an example, we could definitely find synergies and be able to say, okay, I can provide some expertise. We can, find synergies in our best practices, maybe even the locations could be complementary. So that comfort level may, and even I would say knowledge exchange could be helpful to get the quality up overall. So as a consumer or the buyer of the credit, I could say, you know what, I'm not comfortable with this aspect. I need you to do things this way. And that's coming from a place of expertise. So I think that's a way to make the market better overall. And then, of course, I'm not going to necessarily get into the aspects of quality. And I think we've touched a lot on, permanence and, all of the others. So we need to be doing all that as well. So I think to even talk about the reductions, that quality has to be there, and it has to be as good or better than the removals. And we also need the frameworks and protocols in place, et cetera. So it's happening, it's moving, all of that is great. And when we get to that point, I would say that I think it could provide a really enticing solution to industry.
Thank you. You want to come in?
Yeah. Can I just add, on the mitigation hierarchy is, just for alignment with what SBTI or others, or a claim around net zero. Yeah. We are completely with you that we need investment, tech transfer, capital flow into these types of projects now. It's just about how you frame that in terms of the claim that the companies are making. You can't, following the guidance we're receiving, say you're net zero with that type of investment, but you can absolutely say we are contributing through these types of compensation projects and developing the technology and advancing, the industry and so forth. So, I think we're very aligned.
Wonderful. Thank you.
I wanted to ask Pedro one last question of you. I know you wear a couple of hats. Would you mind answering a question with your EDF hat on? Would that be you? And congratulations on a big day for EDF as well. It's been part of the announcements this morning. But as you look at this kind of activity through the eyes of an NGO, how do you feel about it? And I presume the answer is yes because you've been involved. But do the changes and the moves that have been made this week give you further confidence in these markets? And maybe touch again on that point about industrial credits and how you sort of feel as an NGO about those.
I think we're in a space now where I hope that we get to a place where it's a safe place to discuss openly the challenges of industrial credits and industrial gas projects. Put this way, reflecting back on the evolution from the last few years, we've gotten to the point where there's been very much acrimonious arguments against, both on the claim side and on the supply side, against what can we allow oil and gas companies to claim, and conversely, what is really quality? What does quality mean when you're talking about whether it's DAC and technical removals or the older types of industrial gas projects? My hope is that because of this framework, and I have to say I am very pleasantly surprised. I don't know about Mark, but I'm very pleasantly surprised about the reception that we've had, because we've just been so knee deep into this that it is kind of almost have the feeling that I need to pat myself on the back, but also think yes.
We're going to end up singing.
But in the sense that we've gone through this process of it's now safe for me to say, you know what, HSC23 project, and again, not making any mistake, but HSC23 projects were a good idea, badly executed. But they are still a good idea in some cases. And so are a number of industrial projects. The same way that it is, I think, relatively more safe now to say oil and gas needs to decarbonize, and it needs to decarbonize heavily, and it needs to invest heavily into carbon credit projects, but they need to be part of the dialogue. So all of that is leading to a much more optimistic outlook coming out of this particular COP on the voluntary carbon market overall, both on the claim side and on the supply side. Having said, I do hope that we're not regretting this optimism in 6 months, but that's...
Well, thank you for that. I know we've run slightly over time, and so I want to be respectful of everybody's time. I was going to open it to a couple of questions to the audience, but it's late. I think probably people would prefer to get home. But let me take this opportunity to thank my excellent panelists and congratulate them again for all the progress they've made this week. For my presenters online, Gaurav and Torleif here, and Liz for all of the hard work that she's done putting this event together. Thank you for coming, and thank you very much to AITA as well for partnering with us on this session. Thank you all.